Three police officers walked into an upscale cafe in the middle of the lunch hour, and within seconds, their attention locked onto the one woman sitting alone in the corner. There was no explanation offered, no polite inquiry, nothing that resembled procedure. Officer Darius Vance reached down and yanked the handbag from her side of the table, while Officer Caton Rusk coldly ordered her to stand. When she looked up at them with a calm, level voice and asked whether they were certain they knew who she was, all three men laughed out loud. Less than a minute later, the cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists in front of a room full of stunned customers. What none of them knew was that the woman they had just humiliated had been sworn in that same week as the new Attorney General of the United States, and that she had already memorized every single one of their names, along with the exact minute the clock read when the first one spoke to her. The cafe was full that afternoon, filled with the low hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the soft clink of porcelain cups being set down on saucers. Near the window, in the quietest corner of the room, a woman sat by herself, with a dark coat draped over the back of her chair. She wore no jewelry that spoke of wealth, no government badge, no visible security detail trailing behind her, nothing that separated her from any other tired professional stealing an hour of peace before a demanding afternoon. On the table in front of her sat a single cup of black coffee, a leather notebook, and a phone turned face down beside a folder of documents. She was reading through a federal policy memo on police reform, marking sections with a thin silver pen, entirely unaware that the very system she was studying was about to reveal itself to her in the most personal way imaginable. Her name was Imani Sterling, and there was nothing about her posture or clothing that suggested she held more legal power in that city than almost anyone else walking its streets that day. She had grown up in a working-class household where the sound of a passing patrol car meant something different than it meant to most people, where her mother had once told her, quietly and without bitterness, that survival sometimes depended on knowing exactly how to speak, how to stand, and how to breathe in front of a badge. Imani had carried that lesson through law school, through her early years as a public defender, and through every promotion that eventually placed her at the very top of the federal legal system. She had never forgotten what it felt like to be small in front of authority, and that memory was the entire reason she had chosen, on her first weekend off, to sit quietly in an ordinary cafe and simply watch the world move around her without announcing who she was. The three officers entered with the practiced confidence of men used to being obeyed the moment they appeared. Darius, the senior officer, scanned the room out of habit, and his eyes settled on Imani almost immediately, drawn by nothing more than the fact that she was alone, calm, and unfamiliar to him. A young server whispered something to him near the counter, something about an earlier disagreement involving a customer who matched her description, though the details were vague and the identification was wrong from the very beginning, built on nothing more than a passing glance and a rushed assumption. Darius did not ask a single clarifying question. He had already decided. He crossed the room with long, deliberate steps and stopped directly in front of her table, close enough that his shadow fell across her notebook. "Stand up, ma'am," Darius said, his voice pitched loud enough to draw glances from surrounding tables, calibrated for an audience rather than for the woman he was actually addressing. Imani did not move right away. She simply asked why, her tone almost curious, as though asking about the weather rather than responding to a command from an armed stranger. Darius offered no answer. Instead, he demanded to search her bag, and when she declined on the grounds that he had given her no lawful reason to comply, Caton stepped forward to close the distance, his hand resting near his belt in a gesture meant to intimidate rather than protect anyone in the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, a dozen strangers suddenly aware that something was unfolding that did not belong. Imani did not resist, and she did not raise her voice. She simply watched, the way the three men positioned themselves to block any clear path to the door, without ever saying so. The tone Darius used, pitched deliberately for the room rather than for her, and Marlon Creed standing slightly behind the other two, his hand resting near his holster out of habit, saying nothing, his eyes flicking uneasily between his colleagues and the woman they surrounded. This was not a routine check. This was a performance staged for an audience that had done nothing to deserve the show, and Imani understood that long before any of the three men did. "Either you cooperate," Darius said, "or you're leaving this cafe in handcuffs." Imani looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then answered quietly. "Then I suppose you've already made your decision," she said. Something in the way she said it, calm, unhurried, made even Caton hesitate for half a second before continuing forward. Darius repeated his order for her to stand. This time Imani rose without protest, smoothing the front of her coat before letting it fall back to her side. Caton snatched her bag before she could object, rifling through it without permission, spilling a pen and a folded receipt onto the floor in his haste, while Imani calmly asked what the grounds for her detainment were. No one gave her a straight answer. A young man 2 tables away lifted his phone and began recording. Darius spun toward him, snapping at him to put the device away. The man did not comply, and Imani noted the presence of the camera with the same quiet attentiveness she gave to everything else, filing it away as a fact that might matter later, the way a lawyer files away an overlooked detail in a larger case. She did not argue with Darius. Instead, in a voice too calm to be mistaken for fear, she asked him to state his name and badge number aloud, clearly enough for the room to hear. Darius laughed, certain it was some feeble intimidation tactic with no weight behind it. He recited his name anyway, more out of arrogance than obligation, enjoying the sound of his own authority filling the room. Caton followed with a smirk, clearly pleased with how the scene was playing out in front of witnesses. Marlon answered last, and with visible reluctance, as though some instinct in him understood that giving his name in that moment carried more consequence than his colleagues realized. Imani repeated each name silently in her mind, committing them to memory the way she had been trained to, decades earlier, as a young attorney sitting through her first deposition, when a mentor told her that names once spoken aloud could never truly be unspoken. Darius's patience thinned quickly, and within moments he pulled Imani's wrists behind her back and closed a pair of handcuffs around them, the metallic click echoing through a cafe gone almost completely silent. A customer near the counter asked what she had done to deserve this, and Darius answered without hesitation that she had refused a lawful order, a phrase delivered with the confidence of a man reading from a script he had used many times before. Imani turned to him and asked evenly whether he had ever actually told her what crime she was accused of. He offered no response. Caton muttered that she did not need to lecture them on procedure. Imani replied that she was not lecturing anyone, only asking that the law be followed as written, nothing more. As Darius guided her toward the door, gripping her upper arm with more force than the moment required, she glanced once at the small security camera mounted near the ceiling, not with fear, but with quiet, absolute certainty that this moment would travel far beyond the 4 walls of that cafe, into rooms none of these 3 men had ever imagined they would one day be sitting in themselves. At the station, Darius composed the arrest report, with the practiced ease of a man who had written dozens like it before, and never once had them questioned. He described the woman as uncooperative, confrontational, resistant to lawful instruction, and disruptive to the peace of the establishment. Caton signed beneath his name without reading it twice, eager to close the matter and end his shift. Marlon, however, read the report slowly, and something about the wording bothered him, a small itch of conscience he had learned over the years to ignore. Imani had never raised her voice or resisted physically. She had asked calm questions, and yet the report painted her as something closer to a threat than a bystander caught in a misunderstanding no one in that cafe had created. Marlon asked Darius if the wording was really necessary. Darius did not look up. "Just sign it," he said, leaving no room for discussion. Marlon did, setting his pen down with a discomfort he chose not to voice again that afternoon. In the interview room, Imani sat with her hands folded in her lap, posture straight, expression composed despite the metal still pressing against her wrists. She did not cry, did not raise her voice, did not demand a phone call the way most people would have. She simply waited, the way a person waits when they already know how a situation will end, and are only curious how long it will take everyone else to catch up. Darius entered believing he was still fully in control, a folder tucked under one arm, carrying the easy confidence of routine. He asked her name, she gave it plainly. He asked her occupation. She paused before answering with a single word, attorney, delivered without embellishment. Darius smiled, unable to resist a small laugh, remarking that of course she was an attorney, as though the claim confirmed every assumption he had already made about her. He asked who she worked for. When she answered the federal government, his amusement deepened, and he told her that everybody who sat in that chair had a story to tell him. Imani did not argue. Instead, she asked, almost conversationally, whether he knew what time it currently was. Darius glanced at the clock and told her it was 3:27 in the afternoon. She nodded, said that was good, and when he asked why it mattered, told him plainly that at 3:30 his entire department was about to encounter a very different kind of problem than the one they believed they were dealing with. Darius laughed again, certain it was an empty threat, entirely unaware that Imani Sterling had never once made a claim she could not immediately back up with evidence, documentation, or law. At exactly 3:30, the phone on the police chief's desk began to ring. He answered without urgency, assuming a routine call. The voice identified itself as coming from Washington and requested a private conversation, a request the chief granted with mild curiosity rather than alarm. Within minutes, the chief learned that the woman in interview room 2 had been formally sworn in only days earlier as the Attorney General of the United States, and that she was in the middle of an unannounced, unofficial visit meant to observe firsthand how ordinary citizens were treated during routine encounters with local police. No one in that station had the faintest idea who she truly was, and the chief felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him. He asked carefully whether the woman was indeed who he suspected. The voice on the line answered with a single word, yes. The call ended, and the chief sat frozen for several seconds before rising and moving quickly toward the interview room, his heart pounding, his mind racing through every consequence of what his own officers had already done. He found Darius standing just outside the door, still convinced the situation was fully contained. "Who did you arrest?" the chief demanded. Darius answered without much thought, describing her only as some woman who had caused trouble at a cafe. The chief asked her name. Darius gave it, his voice losing its earlier confidence. A heavy silence settled over the hallway. "Do you have any idea who Imani Sterling is?" the chief asked. For the first time, doubt crept into Darius's expression, though he still wasn't fully willing to believe it. Marlon pulled out his phone and searched the name. Within seconds, a headline appeared in bold, unmistakable letters. Imani Sterling had officially been sworn in as the newest Attorney General of the United States that same week. Darius stared at the screen, his face draining of color. Caton took an unconscious step backward. Marlon closed his eyes, bracing for what he already knew, deep down, was coming. Imani's earlier words echoed through Darius's mind with sudden, terrible clarity. "Your entire department is going to have a very different problem." The chief ordered the handcuffs removed immediately, his hands trembling as he issued the command. Darius walked back into the interview room, his voice noticeably different than it had been less than an hour earlier. "Miss Sterling," he began. Imani lifted her eyes to meet his, without a trace of triumph on her face. "Attorney General Sterling," she corrected quietly, and the room seemed to grow colder with every second that followed. Word spread through the building almost instantly, and many assumed Imani would immediately demand the termination of all 3 officers, that she would use her newfound authority for swift, public retribution. Instead, she asked for something far more measured, something that surprised even the officials who had watched her build her reputation in courtrooms for years. "Bring me the arrest report," she said. When it was placed in front of her, she read every line carefully, without raising her voice or offering a single word of anger toward the men still standing awkwardly near the door. She did not scream or threaten. She simply asked, in a tone that carried more weight than any shout could, where the body camera footage was. Darius said nothing. She asked about the cafe's security recordings. Silence again. She asked about the original dispatch call, and the chief, visibly shaken, offered to have the recording pulled and delivered to her as a courtesy, hoping the gesture might soften what was coming. Imani told him she did not want a favor. She wanted evidence, plain and complete, without omission or alteration. She then requested something far broader than the paperwork of her own arrest, every file connected to complaints against these officers and against the department as a whole, spanning as many years back as their records could reach. What had happened to her that afternoon was no longer the sole focus of her attention. What mattered now was a much larger question, posed aloud to no one in particular as she gathered the files. How many other people had experienced exactly what she had experienced that day, except without the power, the title, or the resources to change the outcome? This was the moment the story shifted from something deeply personal into something far more systemic. "I am not interested in punishing 3 officers simply because they embarrassed me," she said, looking directly at Darius. "I am interested in discovering whether what happened to me today has already happened many times over to people who had no way of fighting back." Darius had no response left to offer. For the first time, he understood the woman standing in front of him was not seeking revenge, which somehow felt far more unsettling than if she had been. That evening, Jonah Bell, a former federal prosecutor now serving as Imani's special advisor, called with an urgency that caught her attention even through the small speaker of her phone. "There is something you need to see, Madam Attorney General," he said. When she asked if it concerned the 3 officers directly, he told her it went far beyond them. It concerned their entire department, its history, and years of patterns that had never been properly examined by anyone with the authority or the will to look closely. Jonah arrived the next morning with a thick folder spanning several years: civil complaints, questionable arrests, altered reports, grievances closed without meaningful investigation. Darius's name appeared repeatedly, a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. What troubled Imani far more was the appearance of several senior officials' names, people whose authority should have prevented exactly this kind of misconduct from continuing unchecked for so long. Buried within the file was a memo Marlon had written years earlier, warning his superiors about Darius's repeated pattern of overreach, describing incidents that closely mirrored what had just happened in the cafe. That memo had vanished from the official record entirely, its existence known only through a single reference in an unrelated document. "Who buried it?" Imani asked quietly. Jonah admitted they did not yet know, though the answer might reach higher than either of them expected. "Then that," she said, setting the folder down carefully, "is exactly what we are going to find out." Jonah warned that the deeper they dug, the more resistance they would encounter from people whose careers depended on the old system staying exactly as it was. He had seen cases like this before, starting with outrage and ending quietly, buried under procedural delays. Imani told him resistance was expected, and that the difference this time would simply be persistence. She wanted a structure strong enough to outlast her own time in office. In the days that followed, Celeste Rowan, Imani's newly appointed chief of staff, stepped into the case with the precision of someone who understood that a single local scandal, however dramatic, could easily be contained and forgotten, if not properly connected to the larger federal apparatus capable of forcing real change. She began coordinating between federal prosecutors, oversight boards, and internal affairs divisions across 3 jurisdictions. Within a week, what had begun as a single cafe encounter had become the foundation of a coordinated federal review, touching departments far beyond the one where Darius still worked. Meanwhile, panic settled over Darius and Catan as the reality of their situation set in. Darius sought advice from a colleague who suggested he simply claim it had all been a misunderstanding. But the cafe's camera footage told a very different story, one that could not be reshaped by convenient wording. The most damning moment of all was the instant Imani had asked, plainly and without malice, what crime she had actually committed, a question Darius never managed to answer. A copy of the footage found its way outside the department, and within days it had spread far beyond anyone's ability to contain it, sparking outrage among ordinary people who saw themselves, or someone they loved, in the woman sitting calmly while 3 armed men decided her fate. Yet Imani refused to let the moment become a spectacle built purely on public anger. "Let the evidence speak," she said simply, whenever reporters pressed for a stronger statement, refusing to let the story become louder than the facts that supported it. The pressure on Marlon grew heavier by the day. He understood now, with painful clarity, that he had gone along with something he knew was wrong simply because it was easier than objecting. And that kept him awake at night, replaying moments he had spent years trying not to think about. What troubled him even more was the memory of every other time he had witnessed similar behavior and said nothing, choosing silence over conflict with the people he worked beside. When he finally requested a meeting with Imani, he arrived intending to offer a simple apology. Imani was not interested in easy absolution. "How many times?" she asked directly, and when he hesitated, repeated the question with quiet insistence. Marlon admitted he had lost count long ago. She asked why he had never intervened. His answer came slowly, more honestly than he had spoken to anyone in years. He had believed keeping his job mattered more than causing trouble for people with far more power than he had. Imani did not rush to comfort him, nor did she condemn him outright. She told him that today he would finally get to decide what actually mattered to him going forward, and that decision, unlike the ones he had made in the past, would be entirely his own. Marlon chose to cooperate fully with the widening investigation. He handed over years of arrest records, internal emails never meant for outside eyes, audio recordings that corroborated Jonah's files, and the names of those who had pressured him into rewriting reports to protect the department's image. The investigation pulled in more officers, more files, more uncomfortable questions than anyone at the station had prepared for. Darius, sensing the walls closing in, placed a desperate call to a contact higher up the chain, begging to be extracted before it consumed everything he had built. The answer offered no comfort. "No one can get you out of this anymore," the voice told him flatly, and the line went dead. Days later, Imani called an emergency meeting bringing together Department of Justice leadership, federal prosecutors, internal affairs investigators, oversight representatives, the police chief, and several city officials whose names had surfaced in the files Jonah and Celeste had compiled. The room was tense from the moment the doors closed. One official attempted to frame the situation as a simple miscommunication, a phrase Imani rejected instantly. "No," she said firmly, placing the body camera footage on the table. This was not a miscommunication. She followed it with the original arrest report, calling it documentation, deliberate and written with intent by a man who had done it many times before without consequence. Finally, she set down the folder of prior complaints, telling the room this was not an isolated incident, but an established pattern, allowed to continue under the watch of nearly everyone seated at that table. The room fell silent as she delivered the line that would define the case in the public's mind for years afterward. "3 officers may have been the ones who placed handcuffs on my wrists," she said. "But it was the system around them that convinced them they were allowed to do it in the first place, without hesitation, without a second thought, and without any fear of real consequence." The story was never truly about a powerful woman wrongfully detained by 3 overzealous officers. It was about a powerful woman accidentally experiencing, for one brief hour, the exact treatment countless powerless people had likely endured for years without anyone noticing. Imani demanded an independent investigation into the department's broader practices and protections for every individual whose earlier complaints had been dismissed or buried. Darius was suspended immediately, followed by Caton, both escorted from the building. Marlon was granted limited immunity in exchange for continued cooperation, though he remained accountable for the false report he had signed under pressure, a distinction Imani insisted on preserving, even as she acknowledged the value of his eventual honesty. The police chief did not escape the fallout either. Records showed he had known for at least 2 years about a rising number of complaints against Darius, and had chosen each time to quietly close the file rather than risk conflict with a senior officer who brought in strong arrest numbers. He resigned before the city council could formally vote on his removal. Celeste made certain his resignation did not end the matter, insisting the vacancy be filled only after new oversight procedures were fully in place. Weeks later, Imani returned quietly to the café where it had all begun. No security detail, no press, nothing to suggest the woman walking through the entrance held one of the most powerful legal positions in the country. Evelyn Maris, the café's owner, recognized her instantly, and her first words were an apology. She admitted she had witnessed everything that afternoon and had been too afraid to speak up when it mattered most. Imani looked around the familiar room slowly. "You were not the one wearing handcuffs that day," she said gently. Evelyn agreed, adding quietly that she had still been the one who simply watched it happen. Imani offered her an understanding smile, telling her that sometimes watching closely and remembering what you saw is exactly where courage eventually begins to take root, even if it arrives late. Evelyn poured her a cup of coffee, and this time Imani accepted it, settling into a chair near the same window where she had been sitting on the day everything changed. The two women sat together for a while. No grand speech, only the quiet weight of two people acknowledging something that mattered deeply to both, in very different ways. Imani admitted softly that she had almost decided not to come back at all. Evelyn asked why she had. Imani answered simply that she did not want her final memory of that room built entirely out of fear. Several weeks later, the results of the full investigation were made public. Darius faced formal charges for repeated abuse of authority and deliberate falsification of official records, charges that would follow him for the rest of his career. Khatan was charged in connection with supporting those same falsified reports, his name now permanently tied to the case. Marlon, having cooperated fully, became a central witness whose testimony helped establish the pattern of misconduct that had gone unaddressed for years, a role that cost him friendships within the department but earned him something he had not expected. Imani made a deliberate choice not to let the story end with three men facing consequences for one afternoon. Instead, she unveiled a sweeping set of reforms addressing the deeper issues the case had exposed: mandatory body cameras across every department under federal oversight, secure systems making it impossible to quietly alter or erase official records, independent review boards for questionable arrests, transparent complaint channels free of retaliation, formal protections for officers who report misconduct within their own ranks, renewed civil rights training, and clear procedures for suspending officers the moment credible evidence of serious abuse emerges. At a press conference announcing these changes, a reporter asked whether the three officers would have treated her differently had they known who she truly was from the start. Imani considered the question, unwilling to offer a simpler answer than the truth deserved. "Yes," she said. The reporter pressed further. Did that fact represent the real problem at the heart of the case that had captured the nation's attention for weeks? Imani looked directly into the camera, her voice steady, carrying the same calm she had shown from the first moment inside that cafe. "No," she said, and the room grew silent as she continued. "The real problem was that they should never have needed to know who I was for me to be treated with basic dignity and fairness under a law that is supposed to protect every citizen equally." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the entire weight of what the case had come to represent for millions who had followed it. Justice, she reminded everyone, should never depend on whether the person standing in front of an officer holds a position of power, a title, or a name recognized on the evening news. It should exist equally for everyone, in every cafe, on every street corner, in every interview room across the country. With that, she stepped away from the podium. There was no triumphant music, no dramatic display of vindication, nothing that resembled a victory lap for a woman who had never wanted one. There was only the image of a woman walking quietly down the long corridor of the Department of Justice, her footsteps steady and unhurried, exactly as they had been on the day she first walked into that cafe months earlier, carrying nothing more than a notebook and a quiet resolve. An assistant approached her partway down the hall and handed her a fresh folder containing details of an entirely new case. Imani opened it without breaking stride, scanned the first page for a few seconds, then closed it again and tucked it beneath her arm with the same steady composure she had carried through every moment of the past several weeks. She said nothing dramatic, nothing meant for an audience, only 4 quiet words spoken to herself and to whoever happened to be walking beside her. "Let's get to work," she said, and continued forward into the next case waiting for her, carrying with her the same quiet, unshakable resolve that had defined every moment since 3 officers had underestimated exactly who they were dealing with, and had learned far too late exactly how much that mistake would cost.